One of the world's leading experts on sustainability is in Cambridge tonight to make one of the key headline speeches of this year's Festival of Ideas. Professor Johan Rockström flew in from Stockholm University for the week. He'll be making two other key addresses at debates in the city. But first, he joined me here in the studio with his agenda on how we save the planet before it's too late.
Well, the main point is that science now shows very clear that humanity has reached a whole new juncture. We are now a geological force of change at the planetary scale, and we therefore need to navigate the future in a completely new way, where we do, of course, create prosperity, growth, economic development, but we now need to do it within a safe operating space of science-based global sustainability boundaries or limits, or what you want to call them. So we basically need to now stay within a safe climate boundary without losing more biodiversity, staying within a safe boundary for fresh water. And we've never done that before. It's the first time we now need to become what we call planetary stewards.
Is time running out? And the big question is, what if we don't follow these guidelines?
Well, you see, of course, there's always scientific uncertainty. But today, if you put all the cards on the table, we can basically, with quite high degree of certainty, say we've entered a decisive decade. We have roughly 10 years to bend the curves of negative environmental change. The most urgent one being clearly climate change, where we'd only have 5-6 years before we may start and trigger processes that could self-accelerate dangerous, not to say catastrophic, climate change. So it's a very urgent challenge we have. The good news is that all evidence also shows that we have both the technology and that we can actually have a thriving future if we actually start transitioning towards a sustainable development.
As you know, there's still a debate about whether there really is a crisis. In fact, the Festival of Ideas, which you're appearing at tonight, had that debate last week. Is this all just a conspiracy? How do you answer those questioners?
Well, there are several ways of answering that. The first is, of course, the empirical one. 97% of the published peer-reviewed literature shows clearly that humans are the main cause behind climate change. We have incredibly strong empirical evidence to show that we're in the 6th mass extinction of species in the world. We know that we're eutrophying our freshwater systems, we're overusing fresh water, we're deforesting our forest, and we're undermining a lot of the basis for our own human well-being, which is the resilience and sustainability of the biosphere. So that's one answer. The second one is you can just look out of the window. I mean, basically today, all citizens can be observers of the fact that already at 1 degree Celsius warming, which, irrespective of who causes it, is an observed fact, we see an increased frequency of freak weather events, heat waves we've never seen before, melting of ice that is occurring at a pace we've never seen before. So we see so much observed evidence that things are changing very rapidly at already very small temperature rise. So the science is clear and the observations are clear, and therefore there's all the good argument scientifically to act very fast.
But who's listening? Are the big governments listening? The people that can make the decisions? Are the oil companies listening? Are the worldwide organizations listening?
Well, interestingly, I would argue that business leaders around the world today don't even listen any longer. They're starting to internalize this work because they realize that they cannot have good profit-making business when societies get too destabilized, when markets don't operate, where fresh water is too uncertain, because then you undermine the very basis for business. Policy today, in my mind, is entirely on board. It's just a question of the painful steps of, recharging and rebooting societies towards a completely new logic of economic development. So you have a small minority that still questions, let's say, the basis, but the vast majority are in agreement. I would even argue that the big oil companies today understand this challenge. You talk to British Petroleum and even the chair of BP, who happens to be a Swede, Karl-Henrik Svanberg, he says very clearly it's not reasonable that we can emit carbon dioxide in the atmosphere without paying for it. So there is a recognition at all camps. It's just a question of recognizing that this is a big system change for our entire world economy.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There is some hope. There is some positivity in your message.
There's certainly not a doom and gloom. I mean, remember one thing, that there's nothing hindering us to have a renewable energy-fueled world economy in 30, 40 years. It's a quiet, clean, more democratic, and probably technology-wise much more attractive. So it's not a going backwards future, it's rather going forward futures towards something which is technologically much more attractive.
Some debates taking place in this country right now. Should we have nuclear power stations?
Well, I think there's a good argument to be made that nuclear power stations are becoming both too risky and too expensive. On the other hand, the existing nuclear power plants do deliver cheap electricity, which today risk being substituted to natural gas and coal. So I would argue that keeping up the existing nuclear power plants is a wise strategy in the interim, but I would be very careful before I invested in new power plants, given that solar and wind particularly are now becoming cost effective at scale. The cents per kilowatt hour is actually much lower on renewable energy than on nuclear, oil and coal today.
Wind is something that's a lot of that in this part of the world in particular, but people struggle to see whether it's going to break even, never mind actually be a positive for the economy. What do you think?
Well, today, what we're seeing in countries that have gone to scale on wind, for example, in Denmark and Germany, is that, in fact, it is cost-effective if you compare, for example, to both nuclear and coal, not to the same extent to some of the, I would argue, subsidized natural gas that we today see on the market. So you're starting to see wind and solar coming in par on market competitiveness with, let's say, conventional fossil energy sources. But it's true that at the very early stage of investment, because you need to build new infrastructure, subsidies are required and are used, but it's only in a transition phase. And you're starting to see in Germany, for example, that the possibility of phasing out that dependency today. So, I think we have quite an exciting future of particularly solar voltaics and wind becoming not only scalable, but also competitive.
But we can focus on our own domestic things and make those adjustments, as you say. And then it only takes one trip to the third world to see the smog and the pollution, whether it's Mexico City or New Delhi or somewhere in Indonesia. Throughout the world, in the third world, they can't do this, can they? There's an issue. What do we do about that?
Yeah, I agree, Chris. And not only that, the momentum is so incredible. We have population growth with 2, potentially 3 new billion citizens in developing countries, 1 billion hungry, and an economic growth that needs to climb very, very fast to lift people out of poverty. So, of course, the momentum in the larger developing nations of the world is tremendous. However, China is today the world's largest both producer and exporter of solar technology. India recognizes that it cannot go an oil future if it wants to cater for 1 billion people becoming more and more wealthy. South Africa recognizes the same, Ethiopia the same. So even though it's difficult, and even though we need to recognize a transition period of perhaps 20 years when poor nations need to be using and having privileged access to cheap coal and cheap oil, the transition towards a renewable energy future is more attractive also for poor nations because, again, the technology is, I would argue, with a very high likelihood in a very soon foreseeable future going to be more competitive and more attractive. Remember then the tropics where all the poor nations exist, you have more sun, you have more powerful fresh water to exploit, you have more biomass often to exploit. So, the potentials are actually there.
I think it's true that most like-minded people right-minded people want to do their bit. But even you had to get on a plane to get here from Stockholm. We've all got to live as well as try and save the planet. So individuals listening, what can they do? What small bit can they do that would make a difference, do you think?
Now, I really appreciate this question because one is, of course, a sustainable future is not a future where we simply shut down and go back in the caves. It has to be a future where we prosper and have good lives, and it is difficult. And for example, long-haul flights will always be a part of the modern world. I hope, as many do, that we'll see aircrafts flying on renewable energy very soon. But waiting for that, I would argue that, you have to simply recognize that some parts of our lives are very difficult to have fully sustainable. But on the other hand, there's nothing hindering us today to have full renewable energy to heat our houses. You can use both wind and biomass in a very effective market-based, both in the UK and Sweden and Germany and other countries. We can actually use public transport in a much more effective way. We can be careful in what we consume. We can actually think about those 3 steps: transport, how we heat and electrify our houses, and how we consume. Food is actually the single largest source, not only of climate change, but also freshwater use and loss of biodiversity. We throw away 30% of the food we buy. And so, you have steps you can take. And if you take all those steps successfully, you've taken down your environmental footprint almost to a low bottom. You're basically almost sustainable. But then, yes, every second year or so, you want to take your family on a long travel across the world. I think one should be allowed to do so. You have to find that balance. That's why we need to also share the remaining safe operating space among all citizens on Earth, because we won't ever be 100% zero, let's say, zero committed to not having negative environmental impacts. There will always be some marginal effects.
Professor Johan Rockström, thank you so much.
Thank you.
BBC Radio Cambridgeshire.
And a reminder of the website, it's festival of ideas.cam.ac.uk.